Hi everybody, I'm Kim Bowerman and I am the instructional facilitator at Sonora Middle School. And so I'm here today to kind of talk to you a little bit about writing about reading. And before I get into that, let's think about where we are in this process. We're several months into the implementation process in the district, and some schools are a little further ahead than others, but we're all trying to go through this process together. And I think that probably, if you think about where we are, no matter where you are, you're discovering that there are many, many layers to this. And so today we're going to talk about just another one of those layers and kind of give you some tips that you could use. This is not the, yes, you have to do this. These are just some suggestions of things that you could do in your classroom to kind of help with your writing about reading. So as we go through this process, there are 4 basic questions that I'm going to try to cover. And those are, what's the purpose of having writing about reading in my classroom? And how to improve students writing about reading in your classroom? And then, how do I even get this started in my classroom? And then the last is, once I get it going, how do I maintain it and manage all of this writing about reading? So, first off, I want you to think about the writing about reading that is happening in your building right now or in your own classroom. And if you could take a net and kind of capture all of that writing about reading and kind of scoop it up, what would you see? Would it be different across the building? Would it be different from class to class? I want you to think about that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to talk to a partner. And what I want you to talk about is, what is it that you will see if you gathered all of that writing about reading across your building or in your classroom? So I'm going to set the timer for 2 minutes. And we're going to turn and talk. So let's go ahead and do that. Come back. All right, so I'm going to just guess at some of the things that probably I heard across the district. And I'm going to guess that we probably heard, I hear or I see a lot of summaries. I see a lot of students just telling me about the book they just read. We probably maybe see some stickies or some jotting going on. We might see some statements like this: I think this book was good because, or this was my favorite book because, or I like this character because. We might see teachers giving questions, posing questions to the students, and students answering the questions that were generated by somebody else. Or, honestly, some of us may have said, writing about reading, I'm not there yet. I'm just not ready to do that yet. So that's okay. So we're all in different places in this process. So the first question is, what is the purpose of writing about reading? And it's more than because Lucy told us to do that, even though that's good enough reason for me. But there are reasons that you want to have your kids writing about reading. There are many reasons, but we're going to talk about 3 of them today. And so I want you to think that your writing about reading needs to be mindful. It needs to be purposeful. What is the reason that you're doing this? And you need to make sure that it's doing more good than harm for your kids. And a lot of our students are not reading on the level that we would like for them to be reading on. So the main focus is reading. We've got to make sure that they're reading and reading more than they're writing, but we also need to have some writing in there as well. Too much writing will distract even your high readers from progressing as a reader. Writing about reading this work is hard, and so what I would do is I would challenge your PLC to maybe the next unit, the read aloud that you're going to use, do that as a book club together and work on your writing about reading. I've done this in another PLC, and to be honest, I hated it. I hated to stop and write about my reading, but I didn't understand why it was so hard until I got myself in the middle of it. So I would challenge you as a PLC to try to do that work. The balance should be about 90% of the time should be spent on reading, and 10% of that time should be writing. Now, for your lower level readers, K and below, you really don't want them to spend a lot of time on writing about reading. You need them to be reading, 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 and reading to improve the reading. I and below especially. Your J, K kids, I would lean on the unit as to what it's asking you to have your kids write about, but the focus would be more of a sticky with one word, not focusing on writing complete sentences. It needs to be pretty short because we need them reading as much as we possibly can. So, back to our purposes. One of the main purposes is to make your reading visible. Reading is an invisible skill most of the time. And so I often tell my students that you have to do this because I can't look inside your brain. I don't know what you're thinking. I don't know what's going on in there. So this is a way for you to show me what you're thinking about, but it's also a way for you to practice what we have been learning in class and to get better at that. It gives me a way to provide feedback for you to use as you continue doing your writing about reading. It helps us process what we are reading and what we're thinking. So that process could be evidence of what's being taught in the unit, and we should see that, but it could be different for each student, and it could be different each day because it may be dependent on where they are in the book that they're reading. You want to be able to give opportunity for students to track. Maybe they're tracking how the setting changes over time, or maybe they're tracking how a character changes over the course of the text. You also want to give them a chance to assess where they are and know what their next step is. And that's really big in helping them process what they're reading. The goal is to lift the level of reading through insights, through connections, through analysis. And then we also want to make sure that we extend their thinking. And this is probably, for me, it was the hardest one for me to do because I would kind of forget, honestly. I would get so caught up in writing about reading that we would not really focus on extending our thinking. And some of the ways that you can extend thinking in your classrooms is for students to revisit something that they had written earlier. And that was hard for me. We would just write about reading each week, and we would never go back and look at what we had done. And so to extend the thinking, it's good for your students to look at what they've done and revise that. Revise their thinking as they go through the book. They maybe have thought this way, but then as they continue through the book, they change their thoughts. And so looking back at what they have done and changing that is a good way to lift the level. So what I want you to do is I want you to think about your purpose for writing about reading in your classroom. And if it's not clear to us, then it's not clear to our students. And I want you to think about what were some of the reasons that you had for your students to write about reading, and what did you get from them this year because of those purposes? So I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to talk again with a partner. So let's go ahead and start that now. Thinking about purpose going forward, make sure that when you're having your students write about reading that you know what the purpose is and that you have communicated that purpose to the students so that they know that as well. We're going to move to the next question on the question of how do I improve my students writing about reading? How do I keep them from just writing a summary about the book? One of the things that when you're writing about reading, it goes back to the purpose, is be mindful. Make sure that you know what you want them to write about and be deliberate. Read and have your students read knowing that they're going to be writing about their reading. And that kind of helps get that focus of this is more than just reading to learn about the character. I have to, explain my thinking while I'm reading. So being deliberate and being mindful are good ways to help improve and ways to lift the level of writing about reading. If you think about kind of a writing unit that you've done and our attitude towards that writing unit, we go crazy celebrating the writing that students do, the narrative stories they write or the essays they write. And we have all this pomp and circumstance and we have celebrations and we post their stories in the hallways and we post their essays online. We do all of these celebrations for the writing that they do in a writing unit. But what is our attitude towards the writing about reading? How much celebration do we put into that? And so if we go back to purpose and knowing that we're going to be celebrating this, that could help lift the level of writing about reading for our students. Making them be mindful of the celebration or other reasons to write. So to lift the level, we need to provide that support in the classroom. And one way is through the audience. If you think about the writing about reading, and I know in my classroom that this was an area that I probably needed to work on as well, the audience was generally me, okay? And you write differently when you're writing for a different audience. And as a student, if I know just my teacher is going to be looking at this, my effort may not be as good if I know that my peers are going to be looking at this. And so making sure that they know that it's not just about the teacher and building that into your process where maybe at the end of the writing time for that day, they have to share it with somebody. They need to read it aloud to their partner. Or we have a gallery walk once a week to look at what other people are writing about. Sharing that, giving each other feedback is a good way to kind of lift the level. Another way is to use exemplars. We as teachers need to be modeling what we want our students to do. And as an adult, if you can show me what you want me to do, it makes it a lot easier for me to do that. It helps me think outside the box more. Our students are the same way. If we're not giving them examples or modeling for them, a lot of them, we're going to get the same thing every time that they write about their reading. So we want to make sure that we give them ways to do that. And then revision work, and I mentioned this earlier, where when they write something on, at the beginning of the book, have them go back and revise that thinking, revise their writing that they did. And we spend so much time revising our writing units, and we don't do this with our reading units. So we need to make sure that we're providing the conditions that will support the writing that we're wanting in our classrooms. And through that is the feedback that you give as a teacher, as the students give feedback to each other. Feedback is a very powerful tool to lift the level of writing. And we know from John Hattie's work and others that one of the best ways to accelerate a learner's progress is to provide the learner with effective feedback. So building that into our classroom as well. We also want to make sure that we broaden the topics that students address. We don't want them writing about the same thing every single day, every single week. We don't want them writing about XYZ because they're reading a fiction book or XYZ because they're reading a nonfiction book. We want to make sure that we're kind of broadening that for them. And so we have to look at what is the difference between fiction writing and nonfiction writing. And your units will provide you lots of things that you can use to lean on to get the best writing for fiction and nonfiction. The nonfiction writing, whenever I was in New York and I was learning under Lucy, and one thing that she said that kind of stuck in my mind was that when you have students reading nonfiction, You don't want them reading nonfiction with a pencil in their hand. And I wrote that quote down, and it took me a couple of months to just kind of be thinking that over, like, why would I not want them? Because when we're reading nonfiction, they're supposed to be taking notes, so that pencil should be in their hand at all times. But what happens is that when you're reading nonfiction with your pen or pencil in your hand, you tend to just copy the facts. And you're just you're just fact finding instead of really digging deeper into why the author put this piece of information in there or why this was the way it was. So making sure that we're understanding the difference between the two writings, but also trying to push the level of writing between the two. Another thing is that we want to challenge our students. We don't want them to write the same thing every week. One way that you could do this is give them maybe a list of things that you could write about when you're reading fiction, or a list of things that you could write about when you're reading nonfiction. And it seems kind of corny, but have them check off. Okay, I've already written about character. I write about character every time. I'm going to try to write about something else that's on this list, especially for your lower level readers. Giving them the scaffold to push their level of reading or writing about reading, and being responsive to our students, providing the scaffolds in place, but also pushing our higher students. You know, higher students sometimes get comfortable in writing about the same thing because they're higher. Well, we need to be pushing them just as much we're pushing as our lower level readers. All right, so another way that we can lift our level of writing is to write analytically. This is really hard. This is hard for students as well as it is hard for teachers. And one thing that Lucy said, if you don't struggle, you don't learn. So we need to make sure that we are pushing our kids to think and write analytically. The higher level readers do it more naturally than our lower level readers. And our lower level readers tend to write about what's comfortable to them, looking at the character and what they dress and what they say and what they do, which there's nothing wrong with that. And it kind of becomes almost like a gossip column where they're talking all about this character and they did this and they did that. That's a start, but we want to push their level up. Okay, now you're writing about the character and what they're doing. Why do you think they're doing that? So leading them to think analytically about a text. So ways that we can teach our kids to read and write analytically: partitioning, part to whole. That's big on the ACT Aspire as well. When you're writing about part to whole, first thing you have to do is you have to be able to identify what the part is. What's the part that you're even identifying? Like, what is this? It's more than just a line in the book, or it's more than just a paragraph in the text. You have to be able to identify that. So working with our students, it kind of ties in with author's craft. What is that part and what's its importance? And then ranking. We do this often in middle school. You rank your evidence that you find to support your thinking. You rank your evidence, or you rank the themes that you're finding in a text. These are ways to lift the level of thinking analytically. And then comparing and contrasting text. Comparing and contrasting characters across text. There's lots of ways to do this work, but we want to make sure that we are doing this with our students. Reading differently to let the intention to provide a lens. This is probably one of the ways that as a teacher you can really lift the level of writing in your class, because a lot of times what happens is if we don't give our students a lens to write about, then they read a chapter or they read the book or they read a period of time, and then they stop and they just write, oh yeah, I was supposed to write about something. So they just randomly write about something. Instead, be intentional about what the lens is, and it could look different in different lessons. Before you leave them, or before you send them off to read, during the link. Today, as you're reading, I want you to think about, and you give them a lens. Or, you can lean on the whole unit. Look at all these things that we have talked about in this unit. You pick one. Which one are you going to focus on today? Before they leave the carpet, have them turn and tell a partner, today as a reader, I'm going to work on theme, or I'm going to work on my character trait, whatever it is, so that they have a lens to write about. you'll get a lot more from them than if you just kind of, oh, just write about your reading. And then another way is to make sure that we are citing our evidence from our text and giving them sentence frames and supports to do that work. For example, the text says, or the character says. So providing that, that will help them write differently. So we're going to turn and talk again. And I want you to talk about at least one way that you could change your thinking about writing about reading and how it could become more meaningful for your students in your class. Okay, so we're going to talk for about 2 minutes again. Okay, so I'm glad that we're generating some conversation about writing about reading and understanding the purpose and ways that we can lift the level of writing about reading. But let's go ahead and start talking about how do I do this in my classroom? How do I make it meaningful for my students? How do I lift the level in my class? And again, these are suggestions. These are not the only way you can do things. So when you're trying to figure out how to get this going in your classroom, it's kind of like the other day in our PLC, we were talking about teaks and how that we love them, but a couple of us, for some reason, they just don't fit very well for us, and it kind of makes us upset that we can't wear teaks. But there are other things. We look at other shoes, and you have to try on 10 different pairs of shoes before you find the one that fits you. It's the same thing about this writing about reading. You have to figure out what's going to work in your classroom for you and your students. And honestly, it can change from year to year. It can change from class to class. Middle school, if you have 2 or 3 classes, it may look different in one class versus another class. You just have to kind of try the different ways to help make this work. But the bottom line is, you want your kids writing about the reading. All right, so some ways that you can help lift the level or even get this going in your classroom. One of the things that we do at the beginning of the year, and it's usually the first or second day of school, is we let our students personalize the reading notebooks. Okay, it seems like such a simple thing, but it becomes a powerful tool because it's theirs. And it's better than just this old plain one. I mean, anybody can write in this. It's kind of like, eh. But if I make it my own, it becomes a little bit more important to me. And it can be stickers. It can be something as simple as coloring a sheet, writing their initials, decorating in some way that will personalize it for them. it's like I said, it seems kind of weird, but I promise you, even in middle school, it makes a difference. You want them to have ownership in that notebook. Next thing is your attitude. What is your attitude about the writing about reading? I always hold up a notebook at the beginning of the year and I look and say, look at all these pages. I know it's kind of scary, it's kind of blank, but you know what? You're going to fill those this year with all kinds of writing about reading, and I'll show them, you know, notebooks of previous students, and oh wow, we're going to do all this work? Yes, you are. This is almost like your Bible in my class, okay? Your most important tool in my class is your book. You need to have a book to read in every day. This is the second most important. You have to have your reading notebook with you. So your attitude goes a long way in having the writing about reading. Make it a working tool, right? It's okay for it to be a little messy. It's okay for it not to look exactly like everybody else's. We want them working in it, okay? We want them writing in it every day. We want them using it as a tool to help their reading improve. Working through progressions or rubrics or sentence frames or ways that they can get better. You want this to be a tool for the students as well as for you. As a teacher, you want to use your own. Yes, you need to do your own writing about reading, and you need to model it through the read aloud. Is the easiest way to do this writing about reading. And honestly, you can do it as a PLC so that you don't have to do everything by yourself. But you want to model this and show them, you know, oh man, last night I was reading Divergent and I want you to show what I came up with my writing. Or model it in class. So there's ways that you want to share and use your own. One of the most important things is, what are you going to have them put in here? And again, this is something that could change from year to year, from class to class. Are you going to have reading logs? Well, are you going to keep them in here, or are you going to keep them somewhere else? Are you going to have them write goals and set goals and reflect on those goals? Are you going to have them do read aloud work in here? Are they going to do work they're writing about reading? Are they going to have progressions in here? What is it that you're going to have in your notebook? And you have to decide what that's going to look like. Leads me to sectioning notebooks. Again, this is kind of a trial by error in your own classroom to figure out what works for you. I've done it different almost every year. I have done sections where we put our goals all in this section, we put our reading logs in this section, we do our writing about reading, and that worked well for some of my classes. And then I would have a class that we would spend 10 minutes trying to find the right section, and then we never got any writing done. So we got rid of sections for that class, and we just started on page 1. And we would date page 1, and whatever we worked on was on page 1, and then we go to the next page. So you have to figure out what works for you, again, and you don't want it to be cumbersome, because if you make it so complicated and they're trying to figure out where this goes, or, well, I know I wrote it somewhere, but I don't remember which section I wrote it, I don't know where it is. Make it easy for them. And again, that's something that you can decide in your own class. Showing examples, and to me, this is one of the best ways to get writing about reading. When you have students just write about reading, most of the time you're going to get a paragraph, or you might get some type of a T-chart or something pretty basic. But if you want to raise the level, show them examples of other people's writing about reading. Show them your own. Give them the freedom to be creative. I had a student one time who, I couldn't get anything out of that kid, ever. I don't know that he ever wrote anything his entire education career. But one day I sat down with him, and I knew that he was a great artist. So we kind of came to a compromise that he could draw something that represented his thinking and then write a sentence or two to explain that thinking. Got more out of that kid that year than anybody probably ever did his entire life. So give them examples, allow them to think outside the box. Just because I can't see it doesn't mean that they can't come up with it. And a lot of times, so they might draw circles. It's okay if it looks like that. It's going to be their own book. So it's okay for them to copy what somebody else is doing. But giving them examples sure does help improve the writing about reading. And I know Melissa this year kind of made a contest in hers where she showed them some examples of some writing about reading, and she gave them it was a contest of who could be the most creative. And she probably got some of the best writing about reading that she had gotten all year because it became a contest. Allow choice at times. And this is kind of a slippery slope, depending on what level you are. You don't want students to have free choice all the time because a lot of times they won't know what to write about. So I always would decide, okay, what's my PLC cycle focus going to be? Or what did the lessons this week, what are they going to be asking my students to write about? And so I would require 2 or 3 things that they had to write about, and then the third or fourth could be choice. And the choice, I would give them some things to pick from. So giving them choice, you know, we all like to have choice in things. So I think that you will probably get a little bit better results if you have a little bit of free choice. And then using different tools for writing time. When we went to see a classroom in Van Buren last year, one of the reading teachers, one of her tips was that each week, you know, she had a basket of tools that they could use for the writing about reading, and each week she would add a new tool. So maybe like the first couple of weeks of school, there was only pencils in there. And then she would add colored pencils. And then she might add some highlighters. And then she might add some scissors and some glue. And so each week they would come in excited about writing about their reading because they didn't know what tool there was that they could try to do something else. I mean, they had to use all those tools, but just kind of, you know, in getting that excitement going. The one thing about the writing about reading is, and this is a quote from Natalie Lewis. She's a senior staff developer for the Reading and Writing Project at TC. And I was in one of her classes one day, and she said, it's not what you teach, it's what they show you that they learned. And that's what the writing about reading is. It's showing you what they have learned. These are just some examples of ways that you can kind of generate different ideas. Challenge them to try something different. Give them some scaffolds, like, I don't know what goes on a sticky note. Well, here's some things that you could put on a sticky note. Here's some ways that you could write longer about your reading or write different about your reading. So providing that as a tool for them. Using anchor charts. This is a good way to help scaffold your students. Like, I don't know what to write about my reading. Well, let's see. On this day, we were looking at the relationships. Maybe that's what you need to focus on, is the relationships of your characters in the book. This should be a tool for your students. And a lot of times teachers will make the small copies. If it's something that you want them to do more than once, let them put it in their notebook. They can tape it or glue it right in there and use that as a tool when you're not there sitting there beside them. I don't know what to write about. You know what? You have all kinds of charts in your notebook. Pick one of those, okay? Providing time. That's probably one of the biggest things, especially in our district, and especially in middle school, is providing time. This could look like when you walk in the classroom before you come to the carpet, I've already got on the board what I want you to be writing about, so go ahead and get that set up in your notebook so it's ready to go. At the carpet, this is what I want you to write about today. Giving them a couple of minutes, not 20 minutes, a couple of minutes to get it set up. Now I'm going to send you off and you've already got it started. At the end of reading time, I'm going to set my timer. You have 5 minutes. Let's write about reading. If they can at least get it started, not all of them, and we know a lot of our kids don't do anything at home, but if we can at least get something started in the classroom, there's more of a chance they're going to finish it outside of the classroom. Whereas if we send them back and there's nothing on their paper, they've read for 25 or 30 minutes, oh, what was I supposed to write about? I don't remember. If you've already got that there, then it makes it easy for them. Be consistent. As a teacher, you have to be consistent. That means that you are consistently looking and consistently requiring the notebooks. Looking at them, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, looking at them on a consistent basis, using them. just because you're in a writing unit doesn't mean that you're not still writing about your reading. So that reading notebook should be consistently in their hands, consistently being used, and giving them time to do that. Okay, we're going to turn and talk again. Less time I have to talk. I want you to think about some of the tips that I gave you of how you have writing about reading going in your classroom. Or maybe you already know something that has worked really well. I want you to talk at your tables about what is something that you use that works well, or what's something that you would like to try in your classroom. So let's talk for about 2 minutes. I've talked about the purpose, and we've talked about how we can lift the level of writing about reading. We've talked about tips of just getting this going in your classroom. And now we're going to talk about, okay, I've got this going. How do I maintain all this writing, and how do I manage all this writing? You don't understand how many notebooks I have to look at every single week, okay? I'm drowning. How do I do this? There's so many things. This is kind of, it's all goes back to your preferences. You have to figure out what works for you and what doesn't work for you. What works for your students and what doesn't work for your students. Lucy says all record keeping systems are like relationships. They take work. Again, it goes back to the being consistent. Once you decide something that you're going to have going on, you got to stick with it. You can't just try it for 1 week. Well, I didn't work. Let me try. You got to be consistent for a sustainable amount of time. So some tips for managing all those notebooks. You have to decide what it is. When do I want to look at these notebooks? And it can look different in your class versus another class. It can look different in 3rd grade versus 7th grade. Okay? Am I going to look at them every single day? Probably not. That will be really hard. It'll be easy at times, but it's going to be really hard if you have them writing a lot about reading. Am I going to look at it weekly? Am I going to put some kind of a schedule? How am I going to communicate to the students when I'm going to be looking at this? What I've done in the past, and I've done several different ways, I have taken all 90 notebooks home on a weekend. I wouldn't recommend that because it's not sustainable and you will throw your hands up and give up. What I did do, and this is easier to do probably in middle school because you have more notebooks to look at. And I will tell you, this is messy at first, and it seems crazy, and it takes about 2 or 3 weeks to get it going, but once you kind of get this rotation going, it makes it so much easier. So I would assign on Mondays, these 4 students or these 5 students, your notebook is due every Monday. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Okay? If you're not here on Monday, then you're going to turn yours on Tuesday. But I'm looking at your groups every Monday. Okay? So I've communicated to you, you know when that I'm going to be looking at your notebook. But not only that, in the past, I have created a sheet that they put in the very front of theirs, and they put the day that I'm going to look at their notebook. So they always know, mine's Tuesday, mine's Wednesday, Friday, whatever. And then I gave them a procedure of what it is to get it ready for me. We talked through it every day for a couple of weeks, but then it became automatic. They knew that today's Monday, it's time for me to turn in my notebook. Okay, I've got to do X, Y, and Z, and then I'm going to give it to Ms. Bowerman. Okay, so being consistent with when you're going to be looking at notebooks. There's nothing wrong with you looking at notebooks during conferring time. I wouldn't let that be my only conferring, but you can look at notebooks. You can quickly look at notebooks, okay? So just making sure that you have set aside a specific time to look at notebooks. What am I going to require my students to do in these notebooks? What am I going to look at? Okay? It is going to change from the beginning, from that first unit to the fourth unit. It should change. It may look pretty sad early on, but by that fourth unit of being in writing about reading, they should have all kinds of things in there. So you need to decide what's going to work. Sometimes there's too many things. I don't want to keep up with all these things. I don't want to do stickies. Okay, don't do stickies. Okay? You have to figure out what it is that I'm going to require of my students, and you have to make that decision. And again, be consistent with that. How are you going to provide feedback? You're going to do it through conferring. I would often write them a little note in their notebook. At the end of that week, I would tell them, I would give them a compliment. I love what you're doing here. This is what I want you to work on next. Just a quick next step. I would use this in conferring as well. Okay, so you want to give them feedback. If they're constantly writing about reading and they're never getting any feedback from you, you don't know if they're getting better. They don't know if they're getting better. So feedback is important. How are you going to give the assignments? Again, it's going to look different in elementary versus middle school. It may look different in my classroom versus the one across the hall. I incorporated Google Classroom last year, and it worked well with the schedule. So I would post for the whole week on Monday. And if yours isn't due until Friday, you may not have to look at it until it's when you're turning your notebook, you look at it for what you're going to be writing about for the next week. Very explicit what I wanted them to write about. And there were times that, oh, and you also have choice for this, okay? Maybe it's something that you have across a board each day. It could just be something small that you did during the lesson, the mini lesson. I'm not saying that you want them writing pages and pages and pages every day, but there needs to be some guidelines. So you need to decide, how are you going to give assignments? And this is probably one of the hardest things to do with reading notebooks. How do I assign grades? Because they're doing an awful lot of writing, and I can't grade every single one of those, and you don't have to, okay? There are lots of ways that you can grade this work. Put some of the onus on the students. Before you turn in your notebook this week, you're going to flag your best writing about reading, and that's the one that I'm going to give you the most points for. I'm giving you points for everything that you do, but I'm really going to look at the one that you flag. And so the one that you flag, you probably want to check for capitalization, punctuation, spelling. So there's a way that you could incorporate some of those skills that we're not getting to. Giving them different rubrics for different things. I'm only going to look at Post-its this week, and this is what I want your Post-it. These are some of the points you could get for a Post-it. Okay? I'm looking at the theme this week. Okay? And this is what I want. The secret is you don't have to look at everything, and they don't have to know that you're not looking at everything. Okay? Give them some points for, you know, they did this, this, and this, but the big chunk is that one that I'm going to focus on for this week. And they know that I'm going to focus on this one, or I'm going to focus on the one they told me to focus on. So again, it goes back to choice. We have created this rubric for just the notebook. If you want to give a weekly notebook grade, come up with a rubric in your PLC. Clear expectations of what you want from your students so that they can have clear expectations of what to do. Okay? So there are ways that you can, maybe you just want to focus on the goal this week. Well, this is what I want from the goal. Okay? This is what we're just doing jots. This is what I want from your jots. So having clear expectations with your students. All right, so I want you to think about your own classroom now and all of the writing about reading that you have done this year. What system has worked well for you? Give some ideas to the people sitting beside you, or maybe this sparked an idea, oh, you know what, I want to try this in the next unit, or maybe I really haven't been consistent, so next year this is something I'm definitely going to add to my tool belt. Okay, so let's talk for about 2 minutes. Wrap up our conversations. One thing that I think that you could do is to look at other grade levels. Look at what the 6th graders are writing. Look at what the 7th graders are writing. Go to your elementary and look at what your 5th graders are writing, and 4th and 3rd, and you can kind of see the progression of how the writing about reading should be getting better and should be getting deeper as we go up in grade levels. Just a shout out to my Sonora Middle School teachers. They unwillingly let me take pictures and use pictures, but also to Turnbow Elementary, they let me come and look at reading notebooks last week of 3rd grade students, 4th grade students, and 5th grade students, and I actually was able to incorporate some of that in here. I do not know everything about writing about reading, but I will be willing to help work through a system or answer any questions. You can reach me at kbowerman2@sdel.org, and I will help you in any way that I can. So thank you for your time.